So let's talk about battery selection and maintenance. We learned in our electrical analysis that efficiency in an off-grid system isn't quite the end-all in our design criteria. In the first portion of the program, we learned that lithium-ion batteries are very efficient but costly, and a small lithium-ion battery for backup purposes on a grid-tied system doesn't back up the whole house. So it's used primarily to reduce your electric bill rather than provide backup power. Therefore, the efficiency of a lithium-ion system is very important. But in an off-grid system, most days you are discharging the battery only by maybe 30 or 40% of its capacity. And it's that additional capacity of the battery bank that you're not using. It's only important on those overcast, deep cycle days, at which point adjusting your energy use is more important than the efficiency of the system. It's not to say that efficiency isn't important, but there's other factors involved that are equally important or more important. And one of those factors is the upfront cost of batteries. Now, batteries have different cost metrics. There's the upfront cost of raw storage capacity. So I have a 15 kilowatt hour battery bank. It can store 15 kilowatt hours. How much is it going to cost me up front? Well, then again, that 15 kilowatt hour battery bank has a warranted life. And so whether it's warranted by total kilowatt hours out, such as the Tesla Powerwall, or if it's warranted for 2,100 cycles at an 80% depth of discharge, which you then calculate the kilowatt hours out, that would be the total energy out of the battery. And so you take the total cost, the total upfront cost of the battery, and you divide by the total energy out of the battery over its total life. And that's a different metric than dividing the cost by the storage capacity. And the storage capacity is important. You have power outages. You want to avoid generator use. You want to have peace of mind not listening to that generator run. All of those factors will go into the storage capacity of the battery. We'll read some battery spec sheets. We'll look at some of the efficiency considerations, talk about battery maintenance and temperature considerations. I think that people do not understand that within the flooded lead acid battery category, there is a broad range of flooded lead acid batteries. So we all know that there are different kinds of lithium-ion batteries. There's low-end lithium-ion batteries, and there are ultra-expensive, ultra-premium lithium-ion batteries. But when we get to lead acid, we just think, oh, it runs a golf cart. Well, the lead acid battery used to run a golf cart is very different from the lead acid battery used to run a forklift. And mainly it has to do with storage capacity and upfront cost. But then again, when you're building a high-end, kind of more expensive in terms of the upfront cost lithium-ion battery, like a 1,000-pound lithium-ion battery, where one battery is 1,000 pounds, versus a forklift battery that you can just pick up and put it in the golf cart. There are some real quality and performance differences between those two batteries. Here are 3 different lead acid batteries within the same manufacturer product line. So these are all Trojan lead acid batteries, and this chart is called a depth of discharge battery sheet, where it shows the battery life by how much you use it. So it'll tell you on the y-axis how many cycles you get out of the battery, and along the x-axis what's your depth of discharge. And just by looking at these 3 sheets, we can see these 3 different lead acid batteries are very different from each other. This battery here is rated for, at a 20% depth of discharge, it's rated for about 2,700 cycles. And then it gets to the top of its range where it's a little bit more, you usually are not operating the battery at that top of the range. Kind of loses its storage capacity, drops back down. And cover that more in the intro battery class. This battery is rated for 4,000 cycles, and this battery is rated for 5,000 cycles. So when you look at the cost per stored kilowatt hour of capacity, your cheaper golf cart batteries are cheaper. You know, they might be $110 to $120 a kilowatt hour. By the time you get up into your premium line, or really industrial line is what they call it, batteries, you might get into the, well, it's actually kind of funny, the premium line, the mid-range batteries that are often referred to as renewable batteries or premium batteries may be sold for $240 a kilowatt hour. Well, then you get into the industrial batteries, they actually go down in price a little bit to $200 a kilowatt hour of raw storage capacity. And some of that has to do with purchase quantities, where when you're buying 120 kilowatt hours worth or $20,000 worth instead of $5,000 worth, you get into some economies of scale. Some of it has to do with the actual storage capacity of the battery, where just the case and building of the battery has some costs. So in some sense, there's economies of scale to building a 1,000-pound battery as compared to one that may only weigh 100 or 200 pounds. And so then we also see, going from our industrial high-end battery to our premium battery to our golf cart battery, the shape of this curb is different. I'm not going to get too much into the shape of the curb because it looks like the industrial battery has a shallower curve than the premium renewable battery or the golf cart battery. But the scale of these graphs are different. And again, 5,000 cycles, 4,000 cycles, 2,700 cycles. So that's not really what you want to look at. What you want to look at is kind of the point of deflection in the curb. You know, the golf cart battery, this deflection point is, you get to, we see, well, let's just start first with the premium battery. We see it's kind of starts out as a straight line, and it begins to deviate around a 65% mark. These industrial forklift batteries can be discharged on a daily basis down to 65% and charged back up again and not see substantial wear and tear. In fact, the warranty will say you can go all the way down to 8,000 cycles, or 80% depth of discharge if you want to, and we'll still warranty it for that. Whereas you get into this mid-range battery and the deflection point, we see this straight line coming down and it kind of starts to deviate around 35%. And this kind of golf cart battery, it starts to curb pretty quickly. And we see that it's really around 22 or 23% when it goes from a straight line to starting to bend. And that kind of indicates the elastic range of the battery. The golf cart batteries, you don't want to charge and discharge down to more than about 20 to 25% on a regular basis. The renewable or premium line batteries, you get a little bit more range out of them, down to about 35%. The industrial batteries are much higher quality. They can be much more deeply decycled and stay within that elastic range that does not degrade the battery anode as quickly as when you start getting into that lower range battery. So you have this kind of, I don't know, axiom for flooded lead acid that if you completely discharge it, it won't charge back up again. Technically speaking, that's true of lithium ion as well. If you completely discharge a lithium ion battery, it bricks and you won't charge it back up again. They keep a reserve capacity so that that doesn't happen. Also, that axiom does technically apply to lithium ion too, and what we see is that you can't just say, oh, you can't discharge a flooded lead acid battery because it won't charge back up again. What we see is there is quite a broad range in battery quality within lithium ion. We're going to come back to that. Here's the Tesla Powerwall, or within lead acid. Well, we're going to come back to that. Here's the Tesla Powerwall. 3.5 kilowatt hours of usable capacity. It's rated for 100% depth of discharge. They're actually keeping a little bit of capacity back that doesn't show up on the spec sheet. A round trip efficiency of 90%. 7 kilowatt hour peak and 5 kilowatt hour continuous output. And so if you fully discharge this battery at its full rated capacity, it's going to take about 2 hours to drain it. So you can't put a 13 kilowatt inverter on this Tesla lithium ion battery. They limit you from doing that within the hardware. And it's warranted for 10 years. You go into the warranty, it's actually warranted for some kilowatt hour output. It costs, before installation, just the hardware, $6,600. So you have to buy the hardware. $6,600 divided by 13.5 kilowatt hours of storage capacity is $490 per kilowatt hour of upfront raw storage capacity. And it's rated for 37,800 kilowatt hours of output. So on the one hand, it costs $490 a kilowatt hour. On the other hand, you take that $6,600 divided by its output, that's 17 cents a kilowatt hour. So you take its upfront cost before installation, you divide it by its warranted output, and of course it'll last longer than its warranted output, but we're trying to compare things within their rated warranties for this analysis. Well, that's pretty expensive. When we're talking about outflowing for 4 cents or buying from the grid at 12 cents, you can see how storing the difference, storing 8 cents of electricity in a battery so that you don't sell it to the grid for 4 cents and then buy back for 12, you're spending 17 cents to save 8 cents. And so that idea of daily cycling the battery to do energy trading with your battery bank, it doesn't quite apply to most residential rate structures, or perhaps a more accurate way of saying it, it only becomes economic when that differential between peak and off-peak energy rates becomes around 17 cents a kilowatt hour. And even then, you're just kind of spinning your wheels. You're not really saving money. You're just, using the battery in a cost-effective manner over its life. Now, interestingly enough, I've come across customers who say, I don't care. I want to buy the battery and I want to eliminate my electric bill, and that's what I want to do. Okay. Well, sometimes I talk myself out of a sell when I probably shouldn't. I've also come across customers that say, yeah, I understand that's not going to be economic, but I just don't want to give the power company any of my money. And, in some cases, they have a point. They don't get very good solar policy. So that's why I would call a grid-connected lithium-ion battery, where you're using it to reduce your electric bill, I would call it a spiteful battery. Because it might not be economic to buy it. It doesn't have very good backup power, but we're trying to get our electric bill as low as we possibly can, I guess, for style points. So what I did is I charted the number of cycles each battery type had. I did a industrial flooded lead acid battery, a premium flooded lead acid battery, renewable flooded lead acid battery, which was actually lower in quality than the premium or the industrial. And then I did the Tesla Powerwall too, and plotted their curves for depth of discharge and rated cycles. And what we find is that, yes, lithium ion is a more resilient, more elastic, more efficient battery than all three kinds of flooded lead acid. But I would also argue that industrial flooded lead acid performs more like a lithium-ion battery than like a lower-end flooded lead acid. And so we shouldn't just discount flooded lead acid, especially given the cost. If we kind of if we kind of scale this graph down, which is not perhaps the best way to do it, but what we see is the curve, the performance curve of the battery. Still the industrial battery is all the more closer to the elastic performance and the elastic range of that lithium ion. We have to remember the lithium ion battery is not the rubber band that you can just discharge and charge down to 100%, up to 100%, down to 0%, up to 100%. We like to think that the lithium-ion battery is elastic like that because it says so on the spec sheet, but that's not the full story. You still want to charge and discharge the lithium-ion batteries over a course of 2 hours, not 2 minutes. That's what flywheels are for, or capacitors are for. For that matter, maybe when we talk about combining multiple storage technologies, it would be better just to do a combination of lead acid and ultra capacitors and dispense with the lithium ion altogether. Who knows? It kind of comes down to cost. Well, speaking of cost, industrial flooded lead acid, instead of costing $495 a kilowatt hour, it costs about $200 a kilowatt hour. And that's with 2,100 cycles over 10 years. And the thing is, that's discharging the battery down to 80% 2,100 times. Well, so what does that really come out to? So we have take out our calculator. All right, 2,100 divided by 365 days a year. Okay, so that battery should only last 6 years. No, that's not right. That's discharging it down to 80%. But we saw in the springtime and the fall time, we may be only discharging the battery down to 35%. And only a few times in the winter and the summer do we get that full 80% before the generator turns back on. The rest of the time, it's discharging maybe down to 50% before charging back up. And so in reality, these industrial flooded lead acid batteries, you might be using them down to 60% in the summertime and in the wintertime, and then down to 30% in the spring and in the fall for an average of 45% or so. And so instead of getting 2100 cycles out of them, the way you read these charts is you might say, okay, well, I'm only going to 45%, and so I'm actually getting to, at 45%, I'm getting to 3,000 battery cycles, and that's for this Trojan battery, where at 80% you're down at 1,700 cycles. The true forklift battery that I showed you, we're a little bit higher than that at 2,100 at 80%. And so on this chart at 80%, we're already starting right here. And so we kind of follow this sheet. And what we can kind of expect at a 45% average depth of discharge is about 4,200, 4,300 cycles. And so for a well-sized flooded lead acid battery bank, let's do, just be conservative, 4,200 cycles divided by 365. Warranted life for the batteries is 11.5 years. And if we're being very conservative on our model, we're only going to go beyond that in our life. So our lead acid battery banks may be lasting 15 years or longer, particularly if the client is taking good care of them, having them, serviced. We'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, apples to apples comparison, let's stay within the warranty here. 2,100 cycles, 80% depth of discharge divided by, or the inverse, $200 a kilowatt hour divided by 2,100 at an 80% depth of discharge. Instead of coming out to be 17.5 cents a kilowatt hour, the battery comes out to be 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, you know what? In Mississippi, they tell me the price of electricity is around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And this battery, it looks like under the warranty, it's going to be 12 cents a kilowatt hour, but then I have to go buy all the other stuff. But if I'm one of those grandma and grandpas that's using just a little bit of electricity, I'm not really paying 12 cents a kilowatt hour because of all those fixed fees. I'm paying more like 15 or 16 cents a kilowatt hour. And so with the right solar array and the right battery bank, I'm not all that far off from just regular grid-priced electricity. And it's all locked in. I know what my bills are going to be. It's all paid off. A lot of these solar early adopters are willing to spend a little bit more, as much as 20% more on their electricity, simply to know what the bill is going to be. Certainly to have more reliable electricity. Some do it to help the planet. And, it's just kind of cool to have your own electricity on your own rooftop. Never mind the cost of new construction. Of course, this all assumes that all kilowatt hours are equal, and that's kind of ignorant of the inefficiency differences between lithium-ion and industrial flooded lead acid. So let's see if we can't hone in on what the true differences are between the two technologies. So what we need to do is we need to come back to our battery spec sheets and understand what they're talking about with a 5-hour, 10-hour, or 20-hour rate. if you discharge a battery over 20 hours, that's its 20-hour rate. If you take the same battery and discharge it over 5 hours, that's its 5-hour rate. But discharging a battery more quickly, you know, what I'm thinking of is I guess don't try this at home, but, you know, taking a paper clip and putting it on the top and the bottom of a AA battery and squeezing it. It's going to get hot really, really quick. It'll burn you if you hold it down long enough. That's discharging that battery really quickly, and it's generating a lot of heat. And that heat is going to put resistance into the system. That resistance is going to make the system less efficient by generating more heat. All of a sudden you have a heater, and it's inefficient. It's not that you can't generate heat with your battery, it's just that it's going to be inefficient to do so. You know, so they tell you, oh, well, heaters are really bad to be run off batteries. Actually, heaters are very good to be run off batteries. Heaters take batteries really well. They don't, you know, like motors will start up and surge and drop back down, and those are harder to model. You know, a 1,000-watt heater is going to use 1,000 watts of heat without any surge. It's just, you know, it's a lot of, it takes a lot of electricity to generate heat. That's kind of the beauty of fossil fuels and combustion, is it's a lot of energy in a very compact space. So it can be more cost effective to heat your home with gas or propane than with electricity. Well, back to our battery discussion, when you discharge a battery at 5 hours instead of 20 hours, it's going to have more resistance and it's going to lose efficiency. And so, whereas if we discharge the battery slowly, this 6-volt battery here at 464 amp hours, if we discharge that slowly, we get 464 amp hours. If we discharge it quickly, we get 365 amp hours. Now, the same thing with charging. You know, if we charge it quickly versus charging it slowly, charging it quickly is going to have some inefficiency and be closer to this 5-hour rate than the 20-hour rate as well. Does that really matter? Well, for an off-grid battery, our solar array is so oversized. The goal is to get the solar array all the way up to the top and get the batteries all the way up to the top every day. And then we have all that stranded electricity once we get there. And so we actually have a few kilowatt hours to spare in a well-sized off-grid system. So the charging inefficiency really is not that big of a deal for a well-designed off-grid system, because you know, a well-designed off-grid system should have that stranded electricity at the top that could be equivalent to the inefficiency of the system. You're not going to use that power anyway. Might as well have it be burned off through a 5-hour charge period. You know, we say that solar has like 4 hours or 5 hours of sunlight in a day. That's actually taking the 8-hour, 9-hour window that the sun is up in the sky, turning our modules on, and compressing it into 1,000 watts per meter squared test condition in the lab hours. Our solar array is not on for 5 hours a day. It's on for 6 hours or 7 hours or 9 hours in the summertime. It's just not at its full rated capacity. When we say your solar array only gets 4.5 hours of sun a day, that's kind of a misnomer. You know, what it's saying is it gets 4.5 hours of standard test condition sunlight a day. If we took its full 9-hour sunlight and compressed those hours into standard test condition sunlight equivalent hours, and it gets misinterpreted as 4.5 hours, but I can assure you the sun is up for more than 4.5 hours a day for most of the US most of the year. And so the charge rate of your solar array is really not like the 5-hour rate. It's more like the 10-hour rate. The discharge rate is the problem. The discharge rate, you could say, okay, well, the solar array is charging for 10 hours a day, and there's some overlap with the discharging too. So it's definitely not going to be discharging when it's charging. So there might be 4 hours where it's definitively charging and not discharging, and so the discharge rate's going to be close to the 20-hour discharge rate. Well, that's assuming our load is perfectly flat. And our load, unless you have a well-designed, fine-tuned smart home, which we'll get to later on, your discharge rate is not going to be perfectly flat. And so that's where the inefficiency can creep back in, where people prefer a lithium-ion battery because you can charge it over a 2-hour window and then discharge it over a 2-hour window, and you're still at its same rated capacity. You do the same thing with a lead acid, and it begins to drop off. And the danger is, hey, I only see a 5-hour charge discharge rate here and a 10-hour charge rate right here. I don't see a 2-hour charge discharge rate here. What happens if I try and fully discharge a lead acid battery in 2 hours? In other words, what happens if I install a tankless water heater at 20 kilowatts and just blow out my electrical system and fully discharge 20 kilowatts of my 120 kilowatt hour battery bank? I would only need to use my tankless water heater at full capacity for 6 hours straight to fully discharge my battery bank. And so what would that look like? It'd be a lot of hot water. Well, let's chart it. This is charting this 9-volt battery here at its 100-hour, 100-hour up here at its kilowatt-hour capacity. So a 6-volt battery times 400 times 601 amps gives us 3.6 kilowatt hours. A volt times an amp is a watt. A volt times an amp is a watt. And so we chart this, and what we see is it's a logarithmic decay curve, which means eventually, the difference between the 100-hour and the 20-hour is a lot more flat than the difference between the 20-hour and the 10-hour. And that's a lot more flat than the difference between the 10-hour and the 5-hour. And then by the time you get to the 2-hour, you get any faster than that, and you've completely lost all your efficiency. You're just generating heat, and it doesn't work very well. So that if you go and you take that, if you take a 40 kilowatt hour battery bank and you put a 20 kilowatt load on it, all you're pretty much going to end up doing is generating a bunch of heat and draining your battery down to zero. Now, if you take that same 20 kilowatt hour tankless water heater and you put it on a 100 kilowatt hour battery bank, you'd be discharging it at the C5 rate. So it's, I don't want to give the false impression many have that you cannot use batteries to generate heat. You absolutely can. It's just that generating heat takes a lot of electricity. And so if I only have, if I start out with a 100 kilowatt hour battery bank and it's the winter time and I go 2 days without sun and now my battery only has 30 kilowatt hours left, and I turn on my 20 kilowatt tankless water heater, all of a sudden within an hour I'll have completely bricked my battery. And so the danger is with these heavier load devices like a tankless water heater, that if your battery is already low and you put a high load on it, you'll basically just burn up your electricity by generating a lot of inefficient electron transfer. And that's generally solved in two ways. It's solved by having a very large battery bank, which takes money, And so the price difference between a $200 a kilowatt hour battery and a $600 a kilowatt hour battery certainly comes into play. And B, it takes load control, where, rather than having one device that surges the load by 20 kilowatts, you might go for the tank water heater that just puts a 1 kilowatt load on steady. And you could even go a step further to say, well, actually, I'm going to go back and go to that tankless water heater, but I'm only going to use it at times when my solar array is on full blast and my batteries are fully charged. And so what would be stranded electricity, I'm going to use a tankless water heater to just shave it off the top. And at that point, I'm not using my battery to run my tankless water heater. So you could develop a control system where, a high load device is actually very useful and not the enemy in these homes. The point is, with a lead acid battery, you want the discharge rate to be as smooth and even as possible. And if you do have any surges in your power, you really want them to come out during times that the solar array is on, and have that power come out of the array rather than come out of the battery. And what we also see in this is that discharging a flooded lead acid battery, the C20 rate is really what you want to go for. The C10 rate or the C5 rate is a little more dangerous. And so it's really kind of dangerous to only have a flooded lead acid battery that has a half a day's worth of whole house backup power. Because if you have high load devices on it, the inefficiency of discharging it could really come into play. So you really do want a flooded lead acid battery for off-grid to have a 3 or 4 day storage capacity. You don't want it to just have 1 day's worth of energy, even though on paper the budget might look good. It's let's say you say, well, I'm only going to use 15 kilowatt hours at night, and so I'm only going to have a 15 kilowatt hour battery bank because I'll use electricity during the day, and then at night I'll just drain off my battery down to zero and charge it back up again. It's when that battery is already on low capacity and that surge load kicks on, that's when a lot of heat gets generated from the battery, and it can't handle that at lower charges. So flooded lead acid is really appropriate for off-grid living, more so than an expensive lithium ion, but you want to size it to have a couple of days of capacity just so that under its standard operation, it can easily push that capacity out of the battery bank without generating a lot of heat. There's some pertinent questions that we've kind of discussed already. So what I'm looking at here is now the same industrial flooded lead acid, and I say, okay, well, I calculated that 12-cent rate assuming a C20 discharge. But if I discharged it in 2 hours instead of 20 hours, the inefficiency of the battery would catch up to it, and all of a sudden the electricity from the battery would be 19 cents a kilowatt hour instead of 12 cents. And so if I have loads that are only for a 2-hour charge and 2-hour discharge, lithium ion is more cost effective than lead acid, dollar for dollar. If I'm at a C10 or a C20 discharge rate, lead acid is more cost effective than lithium ion, dollar for dollar. And actually, that means that if I have a grid-tied battery where I'm just trying to store 4 or 5 hours worth of solar and then immediately dump it back into my home on a daily basis, I'm not dumb to consider lithium ion, unless when the differential can justify it. Perhaps more importantly, you get into commercial batteries, and all of the commercial market and the utility scale market are using lithium ion. And so you think, well, wouldn't that mean that lithium ion is the best battery technology on the market? Well, when you use a commercial battery or a utility scale battery, you're trying to discharge it in 2 hours because you have a peak rate where you're being charged not by the kilowatt hour, but by the kilowatt. And it's really an issue for another class, but the commercial batteries are used in a 2-hour window, whereas an off-grid battery, you're trying to provide power over a 18-hour window when the sun's not up. And so no, the off-grid battery is used over a longer period of time than a commercial battery, and that means there might be a different lower cost technology like lead acid that is actually more appropriate than a more expensive technology like lithium ion. And that could change when the cost of lithium ion drops, but we're still at the high end of its price point cycle. When I got into the solar industry in 2008, people were talking about the price drop of solar. In 2009, in 2010, 2011, they're talking about the price drop of solar. And here in 2018, they're still talking about the price drop of solar, and solar has gone from $3.50 a watt down to 40 cents a watt. Lithium ion, we're in 2008 for the lithium ion industry. It's going to come down substantially over the next 10 years. It's fine to be an early adopter of the technology, but that's exactly what you're being, as an early adopter. You can also sit out and wait. And I was talking to one of my customers, I was telling them, hey, do you know I'm installing at $1.70 a watt right now? And he's like, wow, that's half of what it cost me to do my array 5 years ago. And it's like, the thing is, the incentives have dropped in the TVA region, but if the subsidies weren't an issue, if we were just talking about unsubsidized solar, the last 5 years of costs have been kind of wiped out by the drop in cost. So, it was as cost effective just to hold off on your project and do it today as it was to do it 5 years ago with the subsidies. The most noble way to portray the subsidies was that they were there to kind of create the market so that it was ready for when the price did drop. Batteries were still at the end of that high price curve. We're going to talk about this in the battery class, so I'm going to go quickly through it. Batteries are rated for their nominal voltage. So when I talk about a 48-volt battery bank, the battery is actually rated for 60 volts. The thing is, if you charge it all the way up to the top of its range at like a 0% depth of discharge, it'll quickly flush that voltage and push it down into what it can kind of more stably manage. And you only charge it up to that top of the range during a maintenance process where it's almost like you're over voltaging the battery, and what that does is it busts plaque that develops on the battery off of the teeth of the battery that sink into the battery. They're called the anode and the cathode, and they get little barnacles on them during the chemical reactions. Then these barnacles eventually cover the surface of the anode and the cathode, and that's when the battery dies. No more electrons can transfer through the cathode and anode. A simplistic explanation, but hey, batteries are tough to understand or explain. And so the point of that is there's a top range of the battery that you really only charge up to but not beyond, and that's called the float. Then there's the absorb range of the battery, which is the elastic range of the battery, where you can be charging and discharging it without substantial damage to the battery. And then there's the bulk range, which is the bottom operating range of the battery. That is, you can still operate the battery in this range, but it's almost like when you take a paper clip and you bend it slightly, and then you can bend it back, and it's okay. Or you take the paper clip and you bend it a little bit further, and it sticks. You've strained it rather than stressed it. The bottom range of the battery is the stress area, the middle range of the battery is the strain area, and then the top is the float. And so generally with a generator playing free safety of the system, you take your battery bank, and as you charge it all the way down to the bottom of the absorb phase, and once it hits the bottom of the absorb phase, or even just a little bit beyond the bottom of the absorb phase, that's when you click the generator and charge it back up again. You rarely just let it go all the way down to 0. And the battery inverters have settings on them where you can program in all this stuff based on the specific battery that you select. So we talked about kind of looking at the inflection point of the battery to see which is higher quality. You can also look at this is at 20%. This is at 5,000 cycles, and the inflection point goes the deepest. This battery's at 4,000 cycles, and the inflection point is a little bit more shallow. The larger your flooded lead acid battery capacity gets, the larger your flooded lead acid battery gets. I mean, the quality difference between lead acid A to lead acid B is in the build quality of the case, and also the build quality of the anodes and housing material of the electrolyte. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, a lead acid battery that weighs twice as much is going to be twice as large, and it's going to have twice the storage capacity. Now, it might be that depending on the configuration of the battery, it has the same amount of power, but whether or not that's an increase of voltage or an increase of amperage isn't so strongly set in stone. And it may be that within the same form factor of the battery, you could get a 2-volt battery, or you could get with 10 amps, or you could get a 4-volt battery with 5 amps, just to kind of make up numbers to some extent. And so often you'll be looking at your battery voltages, and you'll say, okay, well, I need a 120 kilowatt hour battery bank, and I have a 48 volt nominal battery inverter. And so I know if I have 120 kilowatt hours and I'm going to go with 2 circuits, I need 60 kilowatt hours per circuit. And so, okay, well, let's pull up our calculator here, and I have 60 kilowatt hours per circuit, and I have a 48 volt battery inverter, so I need 1,250 amp hours. Well, here's a 6-volt industrial lead acid, and it only has 464 amp hours. So, I could string these up in series to get to 48 volts, but I'd still only have 464 amp hours, and that wouldn't do me any good. So then I go one up in size, and then my lead acid battery becomes a little bit taller, and its amp capacity goes up a little bit, but that's still not the 1,200 amp hours that I need. So then I go up in size a little bit more, and my battery gets a little bit taller, but it still doesn't have the amp hours that I need. What I need is 1,250 amp hours. And so, now I go and I select a 1250 amp hour battery. Well, instead of being 6 volts, it's 4 volts. Well, is that okay? Well, yeah, I have a 48 volt battery inverter, and instead of dividing by 6 volts and I have 8 batteries per circuit, I have 48 volts and I divide by 4 volts and I have 12 batteries per circuit. And so, yeah, I have a little bit more wiring to do, but it works. Now, that's for 120 kilowatt hours of batteries divided by 2 circuits. 60 kilowatt hours per circuit on a 48 volt inverter divided by 48 volts gives you your 1200 amp hours. If my home was twice as large and I didn't need 1250 amp hours, but I actually needed 2500, I'd pull up my spec sheet and say, well, that's not enough amp hours, and that's not enough amp hours, and that's not enough amp hours, and that's not enough amp hours. Oh no, there's no batteries here that have enough amp hours. And I would be kind of at the upper limit of what manufacturers make flooded industrial lead acid batteries for. So at that point, I either have to bite the bullet and say, okay, instead of doing 2 circuits, I'm going to do 3 circuits. And that's a devil's bargain, because you're going to get mismatch between your circuits. And unlike in a solar array where mismatch causes one circuit to work less than another, but it's kind of okay, in a battery inverter system, mismatch between the circuits causes the whole battery system to degrade faster. And this is the $20,000 component. So that's the one component where you don't want that degradation to occur. At that point, if you start getting into like 6,000 square foot homes with swimming pools on top of a mountaintop, and you need to have a large battery bank, at that point, what you're really designing is a microgrid. And so you'll have different stations of different batteries and different battery inverters. And that's kind of beyond the scope of this class. But what I would say is look at, say, SMA is really good at microgrids. That's, I actually like Schneider really well. And that's kind of, I don't know, most solar guys, they're going to be Outback fans in the U.S. And that's fine too. Well, I wouldn't discount Schneider. They have a lot of capability in their boxes. And in fact, a lot of these battery inverters, Schneider, Magnum, and Outback, all kind of go back to the same original company, in trace inverters. So, there's not that much difference between those 3 brands of inverters. SMA is a little bit different from the others. I'm a big fan of industrial flooded lead acid, as you've probably picked up by now, but it's not set in stone. I mean, one problem with industrial flooded lead acid is simply how much they weigh. So for this particular job, we had to rent an off-grid forklift, heavy duty, to be able to offload the batteries and get them into the garage. Well, then you get them into the garage, and okay, well, you could put them on a 5,000-pound pallet jack, but then you get to your laundry room and the concrete has a lip, and then pushing 4,000 pounds of batteries up a little ramp, it might not work. And so the client actually went and bought a battery crane for lifting the batteries up and setting them back down to get them over the little lips and stairs. He didn't mind doing that. He had a safe And so he uses the battery crane to pick up the safe and move the safe around. So he's found some other purposes to have this battery crane around, lifting up motors. It's not a bad item to have in a shop. But if you're building a tiny house in the middle of New Mexico, there's some advantages to going back to those punier renewable batteries that only weigh 100 pounds each instead of 1,000 pounds each, which is that you can actually get them to site. That you don't need to spend the money on lift equipment, that you can spend the money on your battery bank instead. And when they, the other issue is you go and you use the premium line lead acid or the entry line lead acid even for renewables, or even cheaper than that. Don't even use the solar batteries. Go and use the golf cart batteries that the sales reps will tell you under no circumstances should you use for solar, because they're not intended for that, and they'll die on you within a couple of years. Well, they're also the cheapest battery in terms of upfront cost, and the pricing curve of lithium ion is going to nosedive off the cliff sometime soon, kind of like solar panels started to do back in 2008. And so we look at industrial line batteries, and generally you're sizing the battery bank to last 12 years under warranty and maybe 20 years under useful life. And for my customer, he was happy with that. He says, I don't mind doing battery maintenance. The maintenance seems easy enough. I just want to do it and then not worry about replacing the batteries for 20 years. Okay, I totally get that. And it's cost effective. But another strategy would be to use a lower cost, $110 a kilowatt hour golf cart battery rack. And yeah, there's a lot of wiring involved. And yeah, all those wirings are going to introduce resistance and degrade the battery. And you might only get 4 or 5 years of life out of it. At the same time, they're easy to transport to site, easy to take off site, completely recyclable. So someone will probably remove the batteries for you for free, just for the recycling value left in them. And then you still have all the capital that you didn't spend left over to see where the price of a maintenance-free lithium-ion battery is 5 or 6 years from now. And so particularly for like yurt living or tiny home living, going with the lowest end lead acid battery you can find, provided that it's properly sized, is not the worst idea in the world. If it was me personally building an off-grid home, I would think strongly about doing a starter battery like that. I personally, I think I like industrial lead acid too much not to go with it, but I don't think that people are dumb if they intentionally go with a lower end battery knowing that it might cost more per kilowatt hour output, total output out of the battery, but they're intentionally buying a weaker starter battery bank to test things out and also to see where the price of lithium ion is in a few years rather than a decade and a half. That said, lithium ion is going to be cheaper than it is today 4 or 5 years from now. It's also going to be cheaper 10 to 15 years from now than it is 4 or 5 years from now. So, going with the longer term battery is not a bad idea either. Looking at some of these batteries, we're getting into kind of in the renewable premium line, 40 to 50 pounds a kilowatt hour. By the time you get into the industrial line, you get into about 70 pounds a kilowatt hour, and that is a direct statement of quality. That is why the industrial batteries last longer. have more cycles is that there's more stuff put into the anode and the cathode and the plates and the electrolyte to make it last longer, just like the differences between a low-end lithium-ion battery and a higher-end lithium-ion battery that has more stuff, more chemicals, different materials to help it along. So we talked about how it's common to have two battery banks, two battery terminals, so that these wires coming off the battery are the same length going into the battery inverter. If you have 3 circuits or more, just like with solar, you're going to need to use overcurrent protection before you combine them so that you don't get backfeeding from one circuit to the other, or rather dangerous backfeeding rather than safe backfeeding. Because like if you backfeed the cable, it's rated for the backfeed. If you backfeed with 2 circuits into one circuit, then that circuit's not rated for the backfeed, and that's why the old-fashioned commercial string inverters would burn up, is the circuits would ground fault, there's a blind spot in the ground fault detection, and it would cascade to where eventually you'd have 15 circuits faulting into one single number 10 PV cable. Got too hot, started burning holes in roofs. So it very well may be that on most battery inverters, you only have terminals for 1 or 2 circuits. You know, Schneider, they have terminals for more than that. And so I called them up to ask them how many battery circuits they recommended, and then they said, well, really, you know, we like to see 1, but we don't, you know, we'll still warranty up to 3. That was also with the Hawker battery manager who's providing the warranty. So we talked about how when you're selecting your battery, you know, you get into taller and taller and heavier batteries that have the same voltage, and then we see the taller the battery gets, the more the amperage gets, and then you get pretty much to the top end range of your battery, and then that's all you can squeeze on a circuit. And so we look at 1700 amp hours times 12 volts. Well, it's 1700 amp hours times 12 volts divided by 1,000. You know, that's about 20 kilowatt hours per 12 volt battery circuit. If it's a 48 volt circuit battery inverter, we can fit 4 of them on it. You know, pretty much the maximum kilowatt hour capacity you can squeeze out of industrial flooded lead acid onto one 48 volt battery inverter is about 80 kilowatt hours of storage capacity. And so if you push that to the limits and you do 3 circuits, you know, 244 kilowatt hours is about as high as you can go before you have to start getting into microgrid design with flooded lead acid. And so if you're doing, say, I'd say 5,000 square foot home or taller with lots of toys, you know, that's when you really want to start making sure that they're getting into energy efficiency so that you can have one control room with one battery inverter bank and one battery bank, and not, you know, distributed solar and distributed control rooms throughout the facility. Or do a microgrid, whatever. You know, when you start discharging the inverter so fast, you get into what's called thermal runaway, where the batteries generate so much heat they can catch on fire and burn things up. It's actually more of an issue with lithium ion than it is with lead acid, at least from what I've come across. I haven't come across stories of lead acid being discharged so quickly that the heat sets things on fire. Now, they do emit gas, and the gas can explode things, but when you get into batteries heating up because of the rates of discharge, I really hear that more with lithium ion. And lithium ion guys say it's the cobalt in the lithium ion that doesn't have the heat capacity, and that's what starts the fires. And your high-end lithium ion batteries don't have cobalt in them. Your low-end do. That's really a subject for another class. You know, the point is with your lead acid batteries, they're really not even good enough for load leveling unless you need to load level for a period of 5 hours or more. If you're trying to load level in the morning for 2 hours and then charge your battery back up and then load level in the evening for 2 hours, you know, at that point, lithium ion's the better choice. Personally, I think a combination of the two is the better choice. Battery maintenance, it's not so hard. Each of the batteries have, you have to put water in them. And the water needs to be distilled water. It can't just be tap water. For that matter, your battery rooms should be air conditioned. A lot of air conditioners, kind of the portable units, they can suck water vapor out of the air and create their own water. So there you go. You know, you can have an air conditioner, put it on a tank, take the water out of the air, put it into the tank, and then it's almost like a super soaker. It's just a little pressurized tank with a squirt handle on it, and you put these valves into every battery and then just attach the nozzle, squeeze the nozzle, the water goes in, and it closes off the battery once they get level automatically. So battery maintenance, as far as watering the batteries go, there's watering kits and watering systems to make that process painless and quick and easy. The annoying part of battery maintenance is not watering the batteries or adding the water to it. The annoying part is checking the specific gravity of the battery bank. Almost done with this section. For this, you need a hydrometer. It's almost like a little pipette that gets stuck into the battery. Water goes up the pipette tube and tells you the pressure of the water. You can use that to determine the electrolyte concentration of the water. And you have to track that level in order to maintain the warranty. So this is a task that you do whenever you water the batteries. And the problem is you have to take the little caps of the watering system out of the battery in order to get the pipette into the battery. And so the maintenance task that takes the most amount of time is to take the caps out of the battery and put them back into the battery. And it's just annoying. It's like, well, why can't they design the caps to be pipette friendly? Well, in fact, they do. You know, for industrial forklifts, you get kind of electronic hydrometers where the tube is a lot more narrow than the analog hydrometers, and some of these systems can stick down through the battery watering system. But the problem is these digital hydrometers cost over $1,000, whereas the manual hydrometers cost like $30. And I recommend the one that looks like this rather than the one that looks like this. But anyway, this one's a little bit thinner than that one. A little bit easier to read too. So anyway, like a maintenance professional who does battery maintenance for a living may have the expensive tool, but if you're just maintaining your own battery bank, you may not be so keen on buying an expensive tool. You may just disassemble the watering caps and reassemble them. But the takeaway is you have to do that maintenance in order to maintain your battery warranty. And so this is, they say it's a weekly task. It's more of a task that ebbs and flows based off your battery usage. And so in the springtime and in the fall, this task may be once every 3 weeks. Whereas in the summertime and the winter, every week is what you can expect. I mean, once you get the process down, it's like a 15-minute task, but at the same time, it's something you have to do. And so, for the installers in the room, it may be something where with off-grid customers, you offer them a service plan to do this stuff. If you have enough off-grid customers in a given area, you can be the guy that comes in and spends 15 minutes on site for $25 taking the readings if you have access to the room, and that's your job, is to go around to all your different off-grid sites and take these measurements all day, kind of like a meter reader. So that service, the customers are willing to pay a monthly meter fee. They may be willing to pay a monthly technician to come in and service their battery banks and hydrometer readings. So what did we learn with our battery selection? Well, industrial flooded lead acid right now is a good 60% less than the lower end lithium ion battery technologies. And so we're still a few years out before lithium ion really begins to become the off-grid battery of choice. Until then, lead acid, whether it be your higher end industrial lead acid or your lower end lead acid, is still kind of the king of off-grid. And that can be confusing because there are many good purposes for lithium ion, especially in the commercial and utility scale market. So you can look at those markets and not see any lead acid at all and just see lithium ion and think, oh, well, that must be the superior technology, so I have to use it for off-grid. And then you go look at the cost and you get scared off because it's too expensive. There's nothing wrong with lead acid. I guess the temperature considerations we'll talk about when we plan our control room layout. Maybe they should have been a little bit up close, but actually lithium ion has a much narrower temperature range than lead acid. Lead acid can take high heat. It can take below freezing temperatures. And below freezing, you have to keep them fully charged. You have to keep them charged by at least 50%. So you have to be careful in below freezing temperatures, but they can be in below freezing temperatures. Same thing with hot temperatures. They can be in areas of high heat and not get degraded, unlike a lithium ion. So if you have to locate your batteries outside, if you can't put them inside, lead acid is more robust. I'm not a big fan of sealed lead acid batteries. And the reason is when you seal the lead acid, you can't maintain them. It's kind of counterintuitive. The sealed batteries are so you don't have to maintain them. But an unsealed lead acid battery, adding the water letting the battery breathe, it also allows you to run that cycle where you can charge the battery all the way up to the top of its range and bust some of that plaque off of the anodes. And so it allows you to get a much longer life out of your battery. So a battery that you can maintain is a battery that's going to last longer and ultimately be more cost effective than one that you cannot maintain. If you're going for a maintenance free battery, then I would, it's I don't know, I would be looking at lithium ion, or I would be looking at just doing a smaller sealed lead acid where I know it's not going to be a long-term solution, where it might just be a 5-year solution, and we're going to just run the battery into the ground, mainly because there's nobody there that wants to do the maintenance, and it's going to be expensive, but it's just going to get us 5 years down the road to where maybe lithium ion has dropped in price. And the other key takeaway is, speaking of the price drop, lithium ion needs to come down in price by about 50% to where it is today in order for it to be a competitive, in order for it to take the market share away from that. So right now, my preference is, if you're going to do off-grid, go with industrial flooded lead acid. And for me to back off of that statement, I would have to see lithium-ion batteries drop in price by about 50%. All right, so again, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about inverter selection.